Hello and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. Today we're going to be starting an episode looking at what is known as the paradox of liberation. So first we have to define a couple of the terms that we're going to be using. What is liberation and who are these liberators? We're going to be specifically looking at post-colonial and modern settings, and even more specifically, we're going to be looking at three movements in specific, those being the Israeli Labor Zionism, the Algerian National Liberation Front, or the FLN, and the Indian Congress, which was the body that moved the Indian subcontinent towards their current democratic sort of conception. All of these were secular movements to begin with, meaning they wanted the state to be specifically an institution for liberating, uplifting, and benefiting all of the people equally, rather than a sort of reactionary or religious state, which is something that they've all come to very deeply reflect in modern settings. So this raises the question, which is the entire question of this episode: how did secular revolutions give rise to reactionary states? We'll look at a couple of things first, and by the end of this first part we will directly address what the paradox of liberation is. But first, I just want to sort of give some of the general similarities between these three movements to clarify what it is that I'm talking about. Within about 30 years, all three of these movements, the FLN, the Indian Congress, and Labor Zionism, gave rise to distinct and yet very similar religious reactions within their communities. The states in their current form do not even very closely resemble the ideals of what the people who actually put these liberation movements into place would have seen. And it brings up a very important question, which is going to be one of the underlying questions of this episode: liberation for who, and liberation of who? The modern world is very interesting, especially from the particular outlook of warfare. Most of the warfare that's going on these days is not necessarily between major states and players, but within a state itself, which might actually be one of the telltale signs of a democratic movement or of the sort of trappings of the secular democratic state. The democratic secularists, we'll call demsecs for a lot of this, just because it kind of shortens it, saves a couple seconds, have some very interesting and some very unique problems which arose in this time period, which still to this day need desperately to be addressed. This is mostly the fact that in all of these cases, the people leading the democratic secularist movements were natives of Algeria, of India, of Israel, or of their cultural group, since, especially in the Israeli case, that didn't exist while these people were campaigning. But they were people of the groups which they wanted to liberate, and yet in their mentality, in their being, they were extremely different from those people at the same time. They went to Western schools. Gandhi and Nehru, the two leaders of the Indian National Revolution, were both educated in England. All of the Algerian secularists were educated in either France itself or in schools that were set up specifically by France in Algeria. And obviously all of the Jews that ended up creating the State of Israel were educated outside of the State of Israel, mostly in Western areas. This rebellion against the colonial rule of a foreign power would therefore look very much like a revolution specifically to shift who it was that was in control to someone of the native culture. So for the average person participating in one of these groups, it would not have looked at first sight so much like they were being liberated as they were going from one foreign concept to another. Due to the foreign ideas such as secularism and nationalism that these secular revolutionaries were bringing to the native populations, there was a need for what we'll call internal relations. That is, a direct communication of the ideas of nationalism and liberation, which need to be brought directly to the populations which are intended to be liberated. In many of these cases, this was either not done well or properly, and it may not be possible for it to be done well or properly all in one go in any event. But the internal relations of the liberators to the people which they intend to liberate are of the utmost importance, and as we'll see, there are several roadblocks and several problems with attempting to bring ideas which do not reflect the native setting into those people and into the native culture itself. So, what exactly is the paradox of liberation? Well, in short, the paradox is the fact that liberators must destroy the old ways of the people who they seek to liberate. They must get rid of these beliefs, these cultures, and these values, which tend to be highly cherished by the people who they are intending to liberate. This contradiction between liberating and suppressing is in itself the largest paradox, and we'll see a little bit why that is when we analyze the different tools that are available to modern ideologues and the secular nationalists who intend to liberate their nations. So first of all, national liberation is not only very ambitious, but it's also quite ambiguous. A nation is generally defined as a given group of people within a given area, but in just about all of these cases, there are also minorities, there are also different groups and different ideas, and another problem that a lot of these tend to run into is the fact that once the nationalist movement is started and the foreign oppressor is thrown out, then there is a new need for an enemy in order to continue the fervor. And once you get rid of the old colonial elites and the old people that were running the show, the new secularists who declare themselves in charge, who declare the old ways are gone, who declare the old traditions were bad, and that the people who were liberated needed to be recreated or made into new people, are generally targeted as the enemies themselves. Why would this be? Well, because on the whole, national secularism is a foreign idea. It, as I said earlier, is an idea that came from without that culture itself. And because these people are often schooled in foreign lands, in foreign ideas, it's very easy for them to get taken away from their own movement. Now, why would this be? It's sort of has to do with the way that these movements work in the beginning. A nationalist movement is one of the strongest ways to revive and to bring up a country. This was discussed a little bit more in depth in the series I did about mass movements themselves, and that's why we're going into this now. I want to talk about, since we talked about what a mass movement is and how it gets going, I want to talk about what happens when a mass movement is successful and some of the potential perils therein, or the paradox of liberation. So often in these cultures which are decided to be in need of liberation themselves, there are different groups of people who are gaining from the current power structures and must be uprooted. These include not only people, but also ideas, traditional elites, mediators of foreign rule, fatalistic outlooks, and cultural lethargy. In the 1920s-ish, before the Indian Congress came to rise and liberate their own nation, it was said that the Indian people did not have the ruthlessness and did not have the sort of qualities which were seen as negative, which was needed for political mobilization and for ruling, which is very interesting when you consider the fact that there was a very small minority of actual British soldiers and British troops and peacekeeping forces which were enacting this rule. It would have been very simple at any time for the workers of India to have risen up and killed these people and secured their own nation, and yet they didn't. And this is what the liberators truly seek to liberate the people from. However, these fatalistic outlooks and these cultural norms which keep the people separate from their oppressors are often cherished, upheld, and enshrined in the traditions of the people themselves. So the rejection of these ideas can often seem equal to the rejection of the people who hold these ideas. And once the oppressive regime is removed and these new secularists are in charge of the society, they themselves are set up as the foreigners or as the outside idea. The liberators want to say that the liberators want to help the people of the nation which they are intending to liberate is almost wrong in its outlook. It often seems more like they want to liberate who these people could be, or a different version of them. In many of these cases, it was dismissed that religion and tradition were all that important and that they were dying globally to begin with. And this may have been to make the transition into secularism a bit easier and more narrowly defined, but this was almost always a tragic way to look at it and did not succeed overall as a concept. In many of these cases, the minority groups of the nations which were intended to be liberated were said to be given new rights. Women in Algeria, in India, and in Israel were all said to be equals. The Berbers in Algeria were actually some of the most fervent supporters of this, what was known as a sort of Islamic socialist uprising, and yet once the tide had turned, the Berbers were seen as outsiders, specifically because the Berbers themselves were not of the exact same group. And because the liberators themselves are often physically and also mentally close to the oppressors, they must take very specific action to make sure that the liberation ideals are brought to the people. They generally do this through schooling and through other organs of the secular state, but because the secular state is run by the majority of the population, it can easily be co-opted. And this is what is important. The nationalist movement ends up being so successful that a great majority of the people that are fighting in the nationalist uprising don't actually want the secular national state, which is being supported by the people who started that revolution. They see that the tools of nationalism and that the tools of creating a new man and a new history, which we'll get into in a little bit, are extremely successful for mobilizing a mass movement of people, and they actually take these modern tools and use it to retool their own reactionary, traditional, or religious structures. And this is the very dangerous sort of other side, which we see all over the country, which makes a lot of people question. You may hear someone say that the way that the Algerians today run their now Islamic state is not in keeping with traditional Islamism, just like the way that a modern secular state is not keeping with the way that a secular state was set up 300 years ago. That's because they employ new modern tools, and the nationalism, the recreation of old stories, and the creation of a new person are all tools which were introduced in the first place by the liberators. Therefore, the liberators do not only bring liberation and secularization, they also bring the tools for further confinement and for the general enslavement of the population to a modern version of an old ideology. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. This is a new episode. I actually really enjoyed this book, so I hope that I get to do it a little bit of justice. But if you liked the video, make sure to give me a like. If you want to see more like this, make sure to subscribe. But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.